Um, Joining me now for a discussion on Sean Wall and the Wall family on the anniversary of Sean Wall's death is historian Tom Toomey, the author of The War of Independence in Limerick, 1912 to 1921. Tom, thank you very, very much for coming. I suppose my first question to you will be to perhaps ask about the conditions of Limerick and Ireland in general when Sean Wall was born. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
What people don't, I suppose, appreciate is that when Wall was born in 1887, right, Limerick and Munster was in ferment. The land war was at its height. Now, as I say, we take things for granted today, but you've got to cast your mind back to about 1880, when the landlords ruled. And in the 1880s, the tenants, went to war with the landlords. Now, the British government, of course, was on the side of the establishment and the side of the landlords. They sent a resident magistrate by the name of Clifford Lyde into County Limerick. Now, I'll put it to you this way: the folk memory in Ireland and Limerick would be they remembered the terrors of Cromwell. They remember, or the folk memory tells you about General Maxwell. Somehow or other, the folk memory seems to have forgotten about Clifford Lyde. Now, for a number of years, he rampaged, and the word I use is rampaged, to East Limerick and South Tipperary. Right? As I say, he was a resident magistrate and with special powers. And by God, did he use those powers. At least two. The upshot was that the British authorities eventually realized they're going to have to deal with the problem, and that they weren't going to be able to drive it underground as they had done with previous rebellions. And it ended up with the Wyndham Land Act of 1903. That's the background into which Sean Wall was born.
Do you think then that the overall landscape shaped Sean's parents' views, which in turn then turned the whole family into a very staunch nationalist family?
Well, Walls were farmers in Bruff Hill, just outside Bruff. And in my view, there's no doubt that anyone from a farming stock at the time, their views were shaped by the circumstances. I mean, like up to the land war, 1880, that on, the rise of Charles Stewart Parnell and Michael Davitt. The tenant farmers, they were, they had very little say, they had very little rights. But the land war changed all that. As I said, the Wyndham Land Act of 1903 was the first really meaningful land act by which they actually, the government bought out huge tracts of land from the landlords and distributed it among the tenants. Now, there had been previous land acts, but they were piecemeal. The success of the Wyndham Land Act was based on the fact that it made it attractive for big landlords to sell up huge tracts of land, and this was distributed among the tenant farmers.
Tom, you've done some research on the Bruff Scandal, which would have been in around the time of the Wyndham Act of 1903, in around the time when Tom was becoming a priest. Could you tell me a little bit about the research that you've done and what you've found out?
Yeah, you see, Dean Cusson, who was the bishop, who was the parish priest of Bruff back in 1850s and 60s, he had a brilliant impact on the parish of Bruff. He enticed, I'd use the word enticed, the FCJ Order of Nuns and the Christian Brothers to start up schools in Bruff to educate the ordinary people in Bruff parish. Now, the Christian Brothers had a peculiar situation where they reported directly to Rome. They didn't report to the local hierarchy. And that was an issue of contention for some of the bishops, particularly the bishop in Limerick, Thomas Edward O'Dwyer. Now, O'Dwyer would be today perceived as being a nationalist hero, but the reality is that he was actually a tyrant for most of his time. And he was in Bruff on one occasion, I think about 1896 or so, to give confirmation. And he was sitting reading his office in the oratory attached to the convent when he saw a nun and a Christian brother coming on the altar to dress the altar for Mass. Now, from what we can gather, nothing untoward happened, but O'Dwyer perceived this as being an occasion of sin, and he forbade the two communities to intermingle after that. Now, it was okay for the nuns because they were always going to have Mass said up because they had a big congregation, a big community. The Christian Brothers, however, only had 3 brothers in the community, which meant they weren't entitled to have a Mass celebrated in their oratory, which forced them to go from the go to the parish church in Bruff each morning to hear Mass. And it meant that because of the time scale involved, they never got a breakfast before they went teaching. Now, the head of the Christian Brothers at the time, he was a Brother Maxwell, William Maxwell. He got on to Bishop O'Dwyer on a number of occasions about it. And O'Dwyer gave him, as I said, the deaf ear, with the result that it forced Maxwell to take the small congregation of 3 Christian Brothers out of Bruff. And the moment that happened, the place erupted. It erupted in war, totally unusual, something that you would never perceive today, that the people, you know, the ordinary people of Bruff withdrew their children from the schools and sent them elsewhere. Bishop O'Dwyer to kept the school open by forcing the 2 youngest of the Walls, I think Sean and his older brother Frank, to attend the school on their own. Now, they had to get a police escort every day to go to school. As I say, they were. It wasn't something that the Walls did willingly, but you see, Father Tom Wall was away in the seminary, and the vocation of a priest in the for the diocesan priest was in the gift of the bishop. And by God, did Bishop O'Dwyer let the Wall family know that. And as I say, they were, dare I say, hostages for the fortune. They had to do his bidding, or else Father Tom Wall would have been thrown out of Maynooth. It is, well, a cynic's view on Bishop O'Dwyer that he was 35 years a tyrant and 18 months a hero. And I think that kind of sums him up. Like, there was a contradiction in there, in that he was a very able fellow. Let's be very clear about it now. He was a very able fellow, if very self-willed, you know. He was responsible for the bringing of Mary Immaculate College to Limerick, because he figured and rightly so, that Limerick had been shortchanged in the allocation of universities, and that Galway, a much smaller town than Limerick, had been allocated a university, whereas Limerick hadn't. And as a sop to Limerick, then was the Mary Immaculate Teacher Training College was opened in I think 1898.
And I suppose Sean Wall as commandant then of the East Limerick Brigade, he comes across as a bit of a peaceful man, but he never got involved in any of the engagements or the ambushes or things like that. Would you be able to tell me what you think of, him maybe being possibly a peaceful individual?
My opinion on it is that a lot of this was propagated by a man who wrote a book a number of years ago, Michael Hopkinson, like without really studying the thing. You're most effective when you work at things that you're good at. Now, Sean Wall was a very good man manager and delegator, right? So he organised the East Limerick Brigade, right? He appointed Donnacha Hannigan and Tomás Malone to take the leadership of the flying columns and the fighting men. He organised things behind the scenes to make sure that they had everything they needed to be successful. Now, more egotistical people will take on the role of the leader, the fighting leader, when in fact they're not suited for it at all, and the consequences sometimes will not be good. Now, because the way Sean Wall organised East Limerick, it would be fair to say that, with the exception of the Cork brigades, it was the most successful brigade outside of Cork. And this point was borne out by Florence O'Donoghue, who was the adjutant of the 1st Southern Division, when he said that East Limerick was the only brigade on a par with the Cork brigades. And I think that was a fair compliment. And that was largely down to the fact that Sean Wall worked at what he was good at, leading and allocating, giving responsibility to people who were competent at what they were at. He didn't make the mistake of thinking, I'm God, I can do all these things, and make a hames of them. He, as I say, allocated the leading of the fighting men to Donnacha Hannigan and Tomás Malone, who were two outstanding fighting men.
It's a testament to him as well, I suppose, that, okay, he was a good manager. I think he's peaceful, but he was able to organise the Dáil Loan success. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Like, those 300 and something thousand, about 360,000 collected countrywide for the Dáil Loan. 60,000 of that was collected in County Limerick. 35,000 of the 60 was collected in East Limerick, in Sean Wall's bailiwick. Now, Sean Wall, we didn't mention, was a building contractor who specialised in the construction of creameries. It meant that he had contact all the time with farmers' groups and farmers' co-ops. And in Ireland of the 1918, 1917, 1918, 1920, it was farmers, dairy farmers particularly, who had money, because the war had driven the price of milk up very high. I mean, the price of milk in 1920, it was higher than it was 10, 15 years later, with the result, as I said, that dairy farmers had money. And I do believe that Sean Wall had the trust of dairy farmers because he was responsible for building an awful lot of the creameries around East Limerick, like Killonan, Drumbanna. In fact, there was a cheese house built in Drumbanna as well. So that it was his, dare I say it, his connections and his ability that was responsible, I believe, for the biggest collection to the Dáil loan. As I say, 60,000 was collected in County Limerick against 360,000 nationwide. In other words, it would have 1/6 of the money was collected in County Limerick.
Now, there is a good bit of confusion and vagueness over Sean Wall's death in the witness statements in the military archive. You've done some research and you think you've come up with a version that is fairly steady. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, well, what happened, now you see, as I said to you, there are different accounts, right? But most of them are vague. But the clearest account I got from two young men who grew up around Anacarty, and they told me that on the morning, I think it was the Friday, the 6th of May. Now, the previous evening, Sean Wall had arrived at this house in Anacarty, Terry's house, and he stayed there overnight. He appeared to be very a lot on his mind, and he got up very early the following morning. Well, when I say very early, he got up before 8, and he went for a walk and a smoke up to the top of the Boreen with one of the Carey sons. And while they were up there, now remember this is the 6th of June, or the 6th of May 1921, right? A patrol of RIC men appeared around the corner. Now the RIC rarely left their barracks at that stage, so I would be of the opinion that they were acting on specific information. And they apprehended Carey and Wall, and they said to Carey, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm John Carey or Niall Carey or whatever, Noel Carey is from. I live down there in that house down there." So that's fine. Then they said to Wall, "Who are you?" Now Wall said, "I'm an insurance agent." I have to say, wrong story, because you don't get insurance agents out at 8 o'clock in the morning. And straight away they were suspicious, so they took him away with them, taking him back to the barracks in Capawise. Carey went back to the house where there was a strong group of IRA men, including John Joe O'Brien, quite a number of others. And he told them what happened. And they raced to cut off the police patrol. They raced across country to hold up the police patrol to force the release of Wall. In a fracas that broke out, the sergeant in charge of the patrol, Kingston, was killed. And in retaliation, the RIC shot Wall in retaliation. I believe that, there was different stories about that he ran and he did this and he did that. I believe genuinely that he went for a smoke and to clear his head in the morning with young Carey, and that they were intercepted by the RIC. Now, you would always have to ask the question, what were the RIC doing out at 8 o'clock on a country lane in May 1921?
It's interesting because before he died, he was called to a meeting just before he died, where they discussed the formation of the 2nd Southern Brigade. Would you mind, or 2nd Southern Division, would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
This is where I think, now, you can't prove absolutely, but I believe that there was about 5 or 6 brigades rolled together to form the 2nd Southern Division. And all East Limerick, which was the most successful unit, in the Second Southern Division. They got none of the appointments. Now, the man that was appointed OC was Ernie O'Malley, and he had the biggest say in appointing the other officers. Now, Con Maloney from the South Tipperary, the 3rd Tipperary Brigade, was appointed as the adjutant. Denny Lacey was appointed as the flying column commander. Now, certainly, as regards the flying column, either Donegal Hannigan or Tomas Malone would certainly have had very strong credentials, but they weren't mentioned. The only Limerick appointment on the staff of the 2nd Southern Division was that of Bob de Courcy as the engineering officer. He was from Mid-Limerick. So effectively, there was no one from East Limerick recognised at all. And I think this may have weighed badly with Sean Wall.
And that was despite, of course, all of the successes that the East Limerick Brigade had drummed up over the previous couple of years, you know.
Yeah, well, you see, like the East Limerick Flying Column was the first one formed. It was formed in May 1921. Now, there were many parts of the country where flying columns were only formed in 1921, whereas the East Limerick one was founded, as I say, in May 1920. I might have said 1921. In May 1920.
Yeah.
Nearly 12 months before some counties. I do feel that somewhere in there, Ernie O'Malley didn't have great time for them, and I think that was totally wrong. You know, that if you looked at the, as I say, the most successful, could be argued the most successful ambush during the War of Independence was Drumceen. Now, yes, Kilmichael was bigger, but some of the attackers were killed at Kilmichael. There were 16 auxiliaries and 3 IRA killed at Kilmichael. There was 11 Black and Tans and RIC killed at Drumceen, and no IRA.
No,
so you could argue, you know, you could argue it was the more successful ambush.
Tom, thanks very much for your time today. It's been interesting trying to get your thoughts. I may not agree with all of them, but, like, you know, it's good that, like, you know, we can have this kind of discussion. War of Independence in Limerick, 1912 to 1921, still available in bookshops. Tom, thanks very much, and it has been very interesting to chat to you. Thank you.
Okay, William, thank you, and God bless you.